All right, good afternoon. This is my channel. I'm Celso, and today I'm gonna be reading one of the first books that were made by Lev Vygotsky. It's called The Methods of Reflexological and Psychological Investigation. It's based on his January 1924 presentation to the Second All-Russian Congress of Psychoneurology. And I'm using a website called Marxist.org, where they have several books and writings and papers of Vygotsky. So, yeah, we are all set. This is the first time that I'm going to be reading this. English is not my main language, so there might be some mistakes of pronunciation. And yeah, let's go for it. I'm gonna read all of it in the most natural way, trying to not stop that much. All right, use this as an audiobook. Me myself, I'm gonna use it as an audiobook if I have to come back and read this. So let's go. The methods of reflexological and psychological investigation. Lev Vygotsky, 1925. The paper is based is maybe okay. The paper is based on a talk presented at the combined session of the psychological and reflexological section of the Second All-Russian Congress on Psychoneurology in Leningrad, 6 January 1924. The paper was first published as Vygotsky L.S. 1926, Metodica reflexological e psychologiczego Slovenia. That's Russian. In K.N. Kornilov. Problemy sovremnoj psychology. Leningrad. Okay, so you just have several ways of saying that. The methods of the reflexological investigation of men have now reached a turning point in their development. The necessity and inevitability of a turnaround results from the discordance between, on the other hand, the normal tasks which reflexology sets itself, that of studying the whole of man's behavior, and on the other hand, those modest and poor means for their solution, which the classic experiment of creating a conditional secretary or motor reflex provides. This discordance becomes more and more clear, and reflexology turns from the study of the most elementary links between man and his environment, correlative activity in its most primitive forms and occurrences, to the investigation of the most complex and diverse interrelations necessary for the detection of the fundamental laws of human behavior. Here, outside the domain of the elementary and primitive, reflexology was left only with its general bare claim, equally well applicable to all forms of behavior, that they constitute system of conditional reflexes, but neither the specific detail of each system nor the laws of the combination of conditional reflexes into behavioral systems, nor the very complex interactions and the reflections of some systems on others, were clarified by this general, far too general, statement, and it did not even prepare the way for the scientific solution of these questions. Hence, the declarative schematic character of reflexological works when they state and solve problems of human behavior that are somewhat more complex. Classical reflexology seeks to its elaboration of the universal scientific principle, the law of Darwinian significance, and reduces everything to a common denominator. And precisely because this principle is too all-embracing and universal, it does not yield a direct scientific mean for the study of its particular and individual forms. After all, it is for a concrete science of human behavior as impossible to confine itself to it as it is for concrete physics to confine itself to the principle of gravity. We need scales, we need our instruments and methods in order to appreciate the concrete, material, limited terrestrial world on the basis of this general principle. It is the same in reflexology. Everything incites the science of behavior to transcend the boundaries of the classic experiment and to search for other cognitive means. And now, the tendency to broaden the reflexological methods has not only clearly revealed itself, but the line this broadening will follow has taken shape as well. This line is directed towards the increasing approximation of an eventual definitive margin with the methods of investigation that were established in the experimental psychology a long time ago. Although this sounds paradoxical, with regard to such hostile disciplines, and although, in this respect within the milieu of reflexologists themselves, there is no complete unanimity, and they assess experimental psychology completely differently. Despite all this, we may speak of this margin, of the creation of the unified methods for the investigation of human behavior, and therefore also of its unified scientific discipline, as if it were a fact that is realized before our eyes. The short story of this approximation is as follows. Initially, an electrical cutaneous stimulus was applied on the sole, which evoked a defensive reflex of the foot or the whole leg. After that, Professor Protopopov introduced a very essential change in the procedure. He changed the leg for the hand, reasoning that it is much more profitable to select the arms as a criterion for the reaction as it is the most perfect response apparatus, more finely tuned to the orienting reactions to the environment than the leg. He argues, extremely convincingly, the importance of a suitable choice of responding apparatus for the reaction. Indeed, it is clear that if we choose the speech apparatus as a responding apparatus in the case of a stutterer or a mute, or if a dog, the extremity of which the corresponding cortical motor center has been removed, or in general, an apparatus that is little or not suitable for the corresponding type of reaction, the leg of a person for grasping movements. That in all this case will establish very little about the speed, accuracy, and the perfection of the animal's orientation. Although the analyzing and synthesizing functions of the nervous system are completely preserved, and indeed the experiment proved, says Professor Protopopov, that the formation of conditional reflexes in the hand is reached much faster. The differentiation is also reached faster and is more stable. Moreover, the change in methods of the reflexological experiment makes it very much like the psychological ones. The hand of the subject is placed freely on a table and his fingers touch a plate through which runs an electric current. Thus, if in the study of human reflexes we wish to go further than the establishment of a general principle and set ourselves the goal of studying the different types of reactions that determine behavior, the choice of the reacting organ is a factor of vital importance. Man and animal have many responding apparatuses at their disposal, but undoubtedly they respond to the various environmental stimuli with those that are for them the most developed and most suitable for the given case, says Professor Protopopov. Man runs away from danger with his legs, defends himself with his arms, etc. Of course, it is also possible to create a defensive synthesizing reflex in the foot, but if it is necessary to investigate not only the synthesizing function of the cerebral hemispheres as such, equal the general principle LV, but also the degree of rapidity, accuracy, and perfection of the orientation. Then for this type of investigation, it turns out not to be indifferent which type of responding apparatus to choose for observation. But in for a penny, in for a pound, Professor Protopopov has to confess that the reform cannot stop here. Man has at his disposal an effector apparatus in that same motor area that is much more developed than the arm, with the help of which he can establish a much broader link with the surrounding world. Here I have in mind the speech apparatus. I think it already possible and useful to turn in reflexological investigations to the use of the object's speech, considering this latter as a specific case of those conditional links that determine the interrelation between man and his environment through his motor area. That speech has to be considered a system of conditional reflexes hardly needs any discussion. It is for reflexology almost a truism. The benefits that the use of speech can bring to reflexology by broadening and deepening the circle of the phenomena studied are also evident to everyone. Thus, with respect to the reacting apparatus, there is no longer a disagreement and a difference of opinion with psychology. Academician Pavlov pointed to the suitability of the salivary reflex in the dog as being the last voluntary conscious. That was indeed extremely important as long as it regarded the solution of the principle as such of the conditional reflexes, the mental saliva at the sight of food. But new tasks require new means. The advance forward requires a change roadmap. The second and more important circumstance is that the methods of reflexology stumbled upon certain facts that are well known to every child. The process of stimulus discrimination is not quickly established in man. Much time is required for the established reflex to turn from generalized into differentiated. That is, for man to learn to react only to the main stimulus and to inhibit his reactions to irrelevant ones. And here it turned out, my emphasis LV, that by influencing the object that that by influencing the object with corresponding suitable speech, it was possible to create both inhibition and excitation of the conditional reflexes. When we explain to a person that only one specific sound will be combined with the electric current and no others, discrimination is realized immediately. Through speech, we can also evoke the inhibition of the conditional reflexes to the main stimulus and even of the unconditional reflex to an electric current. We only have to tell the subject not to withdraw his hand. Thus, corresponding suitable speech is included in the methods of the experiment in order to establish discrimination. But the same means can not only be used to evoke inhibition, but also to simulate the reflex activity. If we verbally suggest to the subject to withdraw his hand after any signal, then the result will be nothing worse than in the case of a withdrawal of the hand after the electric current passed through the plate. We will always elicit the desired reaction. It is clear that from the point of view of reflexology, the withdrawal of the hand after verbal instruction is a conditional reflex too, and the whole difference between this conditional reflex and the one established with a reflex to an electric current is that here we have a secondary conditional reflex, and they're a primary one. But also Professor Protopopov acknowledges that this circumstance is rather to the credit of such methods. Undoubtedly, he says, in the future, the reflexological investigation of men will primarily have to be carried out with secondary conditional reflexes. And, indeed, is it not evident that in analyzing human behavior, the most essential aspect, both quantitatively and qualitatively, is precisely the superreflexes, and that precisely they explain behavior in its static and dynamics. But with these two assumptions, the stimulation and limitation, differentiation, of reactions with the help of verbal instruction. 2. The use of all sorts of reactions, including verbal, speech ones, we enter fully the area of methods of experimental psychology. Twice, in the quoted historical article, Professor Protopopov raises this issue. He says, The setup of the experiments in the given case is fully identical to the one used for a long time in experimental psychology in the investigation of the so-called simple psychological reactions. He further includes various modifications in the setup of the experiments. It is, for example, possible to use the so-called associative experiment of Jung for reflexological goals, and with the help of it, to take account of not only the present object, but to detect the traces of earlier stimuli, including inhibited ones as well. Turning with such resolution from the classical experiment of reflexology to the very rich variety of psychological experimentation, so far forbidden for sociologists, outlining with great courage new roads and methods for reflexology, Professor Protopopov, for all his high assessment of the psychological experiment, leaves two extremely essential points unsaid. The present article is devoted to the foundation and defense of these points. This first point concerns the techniques and methods of the investigation. The second one, the principles and goals of the two sciences. Both are intimately connected with each other, and both are connected with an essential misunderstanding that obscures the problem. The acknowledgement of both of these remaining points is dictated both by logically inevitable conclusions from the tenets already accepted by reflexology and by the next step that is already implied by the whole line of development of these methods and which will be taken in the very near future. What is left that prevents the final and complete coincidence and merging of the methods of the psychological and reflexological experiment? In Professor Topopov's understanding of the problem, only one thing, the interrogation of the subject. His verbal account of the course of some aspects of the process and reactions that cannot be perceived by the experimenters in another way, the utterance, the testimony of the object of the experiment himself, it would seem that the root of the difference of opinion is to be found here. Reflexologists are not against making this difference of opinion a principal and decisive one. Thereby, they connect it with the second question, that of the different goals of the two sciences, Professor Protopopov not once mentions the interrogation of the subject. Academician Bekhterev frequently says that, from the standpoint of reflexology, subjective investigation is permissible only on oneself. Meanwhile, precisely from the point of view of the completeness of the reflexological investigation, it is necessary to introduce the interrogation of the subject. Indeed, the person's behavior and the creation of new conditional reactions is not only determined by the exposed, manifest, complete, fully disclosed reactions, but also by reflex that are not demonstrated in their external part, that are half inhibited, interrupted. Following Sechenov, academician Bekhterev demonstrates that a thought is only an inhibited reflex, a reflex that is non-manifest, interrupted after two-thirds. Verbal thinking, in particular, is the most frequent case of a non-manifest speech reflex. One may ask why it is allowed to study complete speech reflexes and if to put great hopes on this area, and why it is forbidden to take account of these same reflexes when they are inhibited. Not exposing their external part, but nevertheless undoubtedly exist objectively. When I pronounce aloud, audible for the experimenter, the word evening, then this word that comes to my mind by association is taken into account as a verbal reaction, a conditional reflex. But when I pronounce it inaudibly for myself when I think it, does it really stop being a reflex and change its nature? And where is the boundary between the pronounced and the unpronounced word? When the lips start moving, when I whisper it, but inaudibly for the experimenter, what then? Can he ask me to repeat this word aloud? Or will that be a subjective method, self-observation, and other forbidden things? When he can, and with this probably almost everybody will agree, then why can't he ask one to pronounce aloud a word that was pronounced in thought, that is, without the movement of the lips and the whispering? For it still was and remains a motor reaction, a conditional reaction, without which there would be no thought. And this is already an interrogation, an utterance of the subject, his verbal testimony and declaration about reactions that undoubtedly objectively existed, but were not manifest, not perceived by the experimenter's ear. Here we have the sole difference between thoughts and speech only. Only this. We can convince ourselves in many ways that they existed objectively with all the signs of material being. And what is most important, they themselves will care to convince us of their existence. They will express themselves with such a force and vividness that they force the experimenter to take them into account or to refrain fully from the study of such strings of reactions in which they pop up. And are there many of those processes of reactions, of those courses of conditional reflexes in which no manifest reflexes, equal thoughts, would not pop up? Thus, either we refrain from the study of human behavior in its most essential forms, or we introduce the obligatory registration of these non-manifest reflexes into our experiment. Reflexology has to study both thought and the whole mind if it wishes to understand behavior. The mind is only inhibited movement. And what is objective is not only what can be felt and seen by everyone, that which is only visible through the microscope or telescope or with X-rays in objective too. Inhibited reflexes are equally objective. Academician Bekhterev himself points out that the result of the Wurzburg school in the area of pure thought is the highest sphere of the mind, essentially coincide with what we know about conditional reflexes. And Professor Kroll, Thinking and Speech, official talk at the State Institute in Minsk, 3D BGU, Volume 2, openly says that the new phenomena detected by the Wurzburg investigations in the area of imaginless and nonverbal thinking are nothing other than Pavlovian conditional reflexes. And a much sophisticated work in the study of reports and verbal testimonies of subjects was required in order to establish that the act of thought itself cannot be perceived through self-observation, that is found ready-made, that one cannot account for it, that is a pure reflex. But it is evident that the role of these verbal reports, of this interrogation, and its meaning for both reflexological and psychological investigations does not fully coincide with the ones attributed to them at times by subjective psychologists. How do psychologists, objectivists, have to look at them, and what is their place and meaning in the system of scientifically verified and rigorous experimentation? Reflexes do not exist separately, do not act helter-skelter, but club together in complexes, in systems, in complex groups and formations that determine human behavior. The laws of composition of reflexes into complexes, the types of these formations, the sorts and forms of interactions within them, and the interaction between whole systems. All these questions have paramount meaning for the most acute problems of the scientific psychology of behavior. The theory of reflexes is only in its beginning, and all these areas still remain to be investigated. But already now we may speak as if it were a fact about the undeniable interaction of different systems or reflexes, about the reflection, interpenetration, of some systems on others. And we can even, in general and rough traits, provide a preliminary clarification of the mechanism of this reflection. The response part of each reflex movement, secretion, becomes itself a stimulus for a new reflex from the same system or another system. Although I never came across such a formulation in any of the works of the reflexologists, it's true, it's so evident that it's evidently only omitted because it is tacitly implied and accepted by everybody. The dog reacts to hydrochloric acid by salivating. He reflects. But the saliva itself is a new stimulus for the reflex of swallowing or rejecting it. In free association, I pronounce nasturtium to the word stimulus rose. This is a reflex, but it also constitutes a stimulus for the next word, buttercup. This is all within one system or between related interacting systems. The howling of a wolf elicits, as a stimulus, the somatic and mimic reflex of fear in me. My changed respiration, my palpitation, my trembling, my dry throat, the reflexes for me to say, I am afraid. Thus, a reflex can play the role of stimulus with regard to another reflex of the same or another system and elicit in the same way as an extraneous stimulus. And in this respect, the association of reflexes is evidently fully determined by all the laws governing the formation of conditional reflexes. A reflex is linked to another reflex according to the law of conditional reflexes and will, under certain circumstances, become its conditional stimulus. This is the obvious and fundamental first law of the association of reflexes. This mechanism also leads us to a very rough and global understanding of the objective, meaning that verbal reports of the subject may have for scientific investigation. Non-manifest reflexes, mute silent speech, internal reflexes which are not accessible to direct observation by the observer can often be exposed indirectly in a mediated way via the reflexes that are accessible to observation and for which they form the stimuli. Through the presence of a full reflex, a word, we judge about the presence of a corresponding stimulus, which in this case plays a double role of stimulus for the full reflex and of reflex to a preceding stimulus, taking into account the gigantic, colossal role that precisely the mind, that is, the non-manifest group of reflexes, plays in the system of behavior. It would be suicidal to refrain from exposing it through the indirect path of its reflection, bearing on other system of reflexes. Recall academician Bekhtierev's theory about the internal, external, internal, etc. reflexes, all the more as we often have internal stimuli hidden from us, hiding somatic processes, but which can nevertheless be exposed via the reflexes they elicit. The logic is the same here, as is the line of thought and the proof. In this understanding, the report of the subject is not at all an act of self-observation that as it were puts a spoke in the wells of scientifically objective investigation. No self-observation whatsoever. The subject is not put in the position of an observer, does not help the experimenter to observe reflexes hidden to him. The subject fully remains, also in his own account, the object of the experiment, but in the experiment itself some change, a transformation, are introduced through this interrogation. A new stimulus, the new interrogation. A new reflex is introduced that allows us to judge the unclarified parts of the foregoing. In this respect, the whole experiment is as it were filtered through a double objective. Indeed, awareness itself, or the possibility of becoming conscious of our acts and mental states, must evidently be understood. First of all, as a system of transmission, mechanisms from some reflexes to others, which functions properly in each conscious moment. The more correctly each internal reflex is as a stimulus, elicits a whole series of other reflexes from other systems, is transmitted to other systems. The better we are capable of accounting for ourselves and others for the experience, the more consciously it is perceived, felt, fixed in words, etc. To account for means to translate some reflexes into others. The psychological unconscious stands for reflexes that are not transmitted to other systems. Endlessly, varied degrees of awareness, that is, interactions of systems included in the system of the acting reflex are possible. The consciousness of the perceivania does not stand for anything other than their being changed into an object, a stimulus. For other perceivania, consciousness is the perceivania of perceivania, in precisely the same way as perceivania is simply the perceivania of objects. But precisely this, the capacity of the reflex, perceivania of an object, to be a stimulus, the object of perceivania, for a new reflex, a new perceivania. This mechanism of awareness is the mechanism of the transmission of reflexes from one system to another. It is approximately the same as what academician Bekhterev calls the countable and non-countable reflexes. The results of the investigation of the Wurzburg schools speak, in particular, in favor of such an understanding of awareness. They establish, among other things, the unobservability of the thought act itself. One cannot think a thought which escapes from perception. That is, cannot itself be the object of perception, the stimulus, because here we speak about phenomena of a different order and a different nature than the other mental processes, which can be observed as perceived, can serve as a stimuli for other systems. And the act of thought, the act of consciousness, is in our opinion not a reflex, that is, it cannot be a stimulus, but is a transmission mechanism between systems of reflexes. Of course, in such an understanding, which makes a principled and radical methodological distinction between the verbal report of the object and his self-observation, the scientific nature of the instruction and interrogation also changes in a most radical way. The instruction does not suggest the subject do part of the observation himself. To split his attention and direct it to his own experiences, nothing of the sort. The instruction, as a system of conditional reflexes, as a preliminary, elicits the reflexes of the set necessary for the experiment, which determine the further course of the reactions, and the set reflexes of the transmission mechanisms, precisely those which have to be used in the course of the experiment. Here, the instruction regarding the secondary, reflected reflexes in a principle differs nor at all from the instruction regarding primary reflexes. In the first case, say the word which you just pronounced for yourself. In the second, withdraw your hand. Further, the interrogation itself is not any more the questioning of the subject about his experience. The case changes principally and radically. The subject is not any more a witness testifying about a crime, which he witnessed as an eyewitness, his role earlier, but the criminal himself, and what is most important, at the very moment of the crime. Not interrogation after experiment, when the experiment is finished, but interrogation as the continuation of the experiment, as its organic inherent part, as the experiment itself. Interrogation is absolutely inseparable from the first part, and merely utilizes the experiment data in the process of the experiment itself. The interrogation is no superstructure on the experiment, but the experiment itself, which has not yet been finished and still continues. The interrogation has to be composed, therefore, not like conversation, speech, and interrogation by the experimenter, but as a system of stimuli with an accurate registration of each sound, with the strictest choice of only those reflected systems of reflexes, which in the given experiment can have an absolutely trustworthy, scientific, and objective meaning. This is why each system of modifications of the interrogation, to take the subject awareness a partial method, etc., has great meaning. A strictly objective system and methods of interrogation have to be created as part of the stimuli introduced in the experiment. And of course, non organized self observation, as most of its testimony, can have no objective meaning. One has to know about what one can ask. In the case of the vagueness of words, definitions, terms, and concepts, we cannot, in an objectively trustworthy way, connect the testimony of the subject about a slightly feeling or difficulty with the objective reflex stimulus that elicited that testimony. But the testimony of the subject at the sound thunder, I thought lightning, can have a perfectly objective meaning, which can indirectly establish that the word thunder, the subject reacted with the non-manifest reflex lightning. Thus, a radical reform of the methods of the interrogation instruction is needed will take into account the testimony of the subject. I claim that in each particular case, such perfectly objective methods are possible, which will turn the interrogation of the subject into a perfectly accurate scientific experiment. Here, I wish to raise 2 points. One restricting what was said before, the other extending its meaning. The restricted sense of these claims is clear of itself. This modification of the experiment is applicable to the adult, normal person who can understand and speak our language. Neither with the newly born infant, nor with the mental patient, nor with the criminal who hides something. Can we conduct an interrogation? We will not do it precisely because we'll with them the interlacing of the system of reflexes, consciousness. The transmission of reflexes to the speech system is either not developed, disturbed by a disease, or inhibited and suppressed by other, more powerful set reflexes. But for the adult, normal person who has of his own free will agreed to the experiment, this experiment is indispensable. Indeed, in man, a group of reflexes that we should correctly call the system of reflexes of social contact easily stands out. These are reflexes to stimuli that in their turn can be created by man. The word that is heard is a stimulus. The pronounced word the reflex that creates the same stimulus. These reversible reflexes that create the basis for consciousnesses, the interlacing of the reflexes, also serve as the basis of social interaction and the collective coordination of behavior, which, by the way, points to the social origin of consciousness. From the whole mass of stimuli, one group clearly stands out for me, the group of social stimuli coming from people. It stands out because I, myself, can reconstruct these stimuli because they very soon become reversible for me, and thus determine my behavior in another way from all others. They make me comparable, identical with myself. The source of social behavior and consciousness also lies in speech, in the broad sense of the word. Speech is on the one hand a system of reflexes of social contact, and on the other hand, primarily a system of reflexes of consciousness. That is, for the reflection of the influence of other systems. That is why the key to the solution of the problem of the external ego, of the cognition of another person's mind, lies here. The mechanism of consciousness of the self-consciousness, and the cognition of others is the same. We are conscious of ourselves because we are conscious of others, and with the same method as we are conscious of others because we are the same vis-a-vis ourselves as other vis-a-vis us. We are conscious of ourselves only to the extent that we are another to ourselves. That is, to the extent that we can again perceive our own reflexes as stimuli. There is in principle no difference in mechanism whatsoever between the fact that I can repeat aloud a word spoken silently and the fact that I can repeat a word spoken by another. Both are reversible reflex stimuli. That is why in the social contact between the experimenter and the subject, when this contact proceeds normally with persons who are adult, etc., the system of speech reflexes has all the trustworthiness of a scientific fact for the experimenter provided that all conditions have been observed, and something absolutely correct has been selected, something absolutely needed, and of which the connection which the reflexes understudy has been taken into account by us beforehand. The second extended sense of what was said above can be most easily expressed as follows: the interrogation of the subject with the goal of a perfectly objective study and account of non-manifest reflexes is an essential part of each experimental investigation of a normal person in the waking state. I do not have in mind here the testimony of the self-observation of subjective experiences that academician Bekhterev rightly considers to have but supplementary, secondary, subsidiary meaning, but the objective part of the experiment that cannot be missed by hardly any experiment, and that itself serves as a verifying instance which provides a sanction of trustworthiness to the results of the preceding part of the experiment. Indeed, compared to the complete reflexes mind, in general plays a larger and larger role in higher organisms and men. And to not study it is to refrain from the study, precisely the objective study and not the one-sided subjective caricature of human behavior. In experience with intelligent persons, there is not one case where the factor of inhibited reflexes does not in one or the other way determine the behavior of the subject and can be completely eliminated from the phenomena under study and ignored. There is no experimental study of behavior where the manifest reflexes are unaccompanied by the reflexes that are not accessible to the eye or the ear. Therefore, there can be no case where we could refrain from this, albeit purely verificatory part of the experiment. And in essence, this element is introduced by experimenters. It cannot be introduced, but precisely as a speech, as a conversation, which is not taken into account on the same scientific level as the other elements of the experiment. When your subject tells you that he did not understand the instruction, do you really not take into account this speech reflex later as a clear testimony of the fact that your stimulus did not elicit the set reflexes you needed? And when you're yourself as the subject whether he understood the instruction, is not this natural precaution really an appeal to a complete reflecting reflex of the word yes or no, as to a testimony about a series of inhibited reflexes? And the declaration of the subject, I recalled something unpleasant, after a very delayed reaction. Is it really not taken into account by the experimenter, etc., etc.? We could give thousands of examples of the unscientific use of this method, for the method cannot be avoided. And when a reaction is delayed unexpectedly and not in line with the other series of tests, would it really not be useful to turn to the subject ourselves with the question, were you thinking of something else during the experiment? And to receive the answer, yes, I was all the time calculating whether in all places I received enough change today. And not only in these cases, in these accidents, is it useful and essential to ask for a testimony from the subject in order to determine the reflexes of his set, to take into account the essential hidden reflexes elicited by us, to check whether there were no extraneous reflexes. Yes, for 1,000 other reasons, it is necessary to introduce scientifically elaborated methods of interrogation instead of the talk, the conversation that inevitably pops up in the experiment. But of course, these methods are in need of complex modifications in each particular case. Curiously enough, to finish this topic and to switch to another one intimately connected with it, the reflexologists who have fully and entirely accepted the methods of experimental psychology omit precisely this point, evidently because they think it superfluous and in principle without anything to do with objective methods, etc. In this respect, volume 4 of New Ideas in Medicine, Petrograd, Obrazovanie, 1923, is very interesting. In a number of articles, a new line of development in methods is outlined that goes in the same direction as that of Professor Protopopov, and with the same peculiarity, the exclusion of the interrogation. Matters stand the same in practice. When it turned to experiments with humans, the Pavlovian school reproduced all methods of psychology with the exception of interrogation. Would not this partially explain the meagerness of the conclusions, the poverty of the results of the investigations which we witness in this Congress during the presentations about these experiments? What can they establish other than the general principle that has been established a long time ago and more eloquently? And the fact that in men reflexes can be created faster than in dogs, this is clear without any experiments. To assert the obvious and to repeat the ABC remains the inevitable fate of all experiments who do not wish to alter radically the methods of their investigation. Here, I have set myself the goal of creating a plan for the construction of a unified scientific objective system of methods for investigation of an experiment with human behavior, and to defend this attempt theoretically. Theoretically. But this technical problem is intimately connected, as I have said already, with another difference of opinion of a theoretical nature which the reflexologists emphasize even when they acknowledge the methods of investigation shared with psychology. Professor Protopopov expressed himself as follows: the inclusion into these methods of reflexology of methods of investigation applied already a long time ago in experimental psychology, form the result of the natural development of reflexology and does not at all imply the transformation of reflexology into psychology. The gradual perfection of the reflexological methods by accident, may emphasis LV, led to forms of investigation that only seen from the outside look like the ones applied in psychology. The foundations of principle, the subject, and the goals of these two disciplines remain completely different. While psychology studies the mental process and spiritual experience for their objective side, etc., etc. The rest is well known to anyone who reads the booklet of reflexology. It seems to me that it is not difficult to show that this rapprochement is not accidental and that the similarity in forms is not only external, to the extent that reflexology aspires to explain the whole behavior of man, it will inevitably have to deal with the same material as psychology. The question is as follows: can reflexology dismiss and fully ignore the mind as a system of non-manifest reflexes and interrelations of different systems? Is a scientific explanation of human behavior possible without the mind? Does a psychology without a soul, the psychology without any metaphysics, have to be transformed into a psychology without a mind, into reflexology? Biologically speaking, it would be absurd to suggest that the mind is completely unnecessary in the behavioral system. We would either have to accept that clear absurdity, absurdity or deny the existence of the mind. But for this, not even the most extreme physiologists are prepared. Neither academician Pavlov nor academician Bekhterev. Academician Pavlov openly says that our subjective states are for us a reality of the first order. They give direction to our daily life, they determine the progress of human society. But it is one thing to live according to the subjective states and quite another to analyze their mechanism in a purely scientific way. 20 years of experience with the objective study of higher nervous system, Petrograd, 1923. Thus, there is a reality of the first order that gives direction to our daily life. This is the most important. And yet, the objective study of higher nervous activity, behavior, can ignore this reality that gives direction to our behavior, this mind. Only one thing in life, says academician Pavlov, is of actual interest for us, our physical experience. What interests man most of all is his consciousness, the torments of consciousness. An academician Pavlov himself acknowledged that we cannot ignore them, the mental phenomena, because they are intimately connected with the psychological phenomena that determine the integral function of the organ. After this, can we refrain from the study of the mind? Academician Pavlov himself very correctly defines the role of each science when he says that reflexology built the foundation of nervous activity and psychology the higher superstructure. And as a simple and elementary is understandable without the complex, whereas the complex cannot be explained without the elementary, it follows that our position is better for our investigations, our success, do not in any way depend on their investigations. On the contrary, it seems to me that our investigations should have great significance for psychologists, as they eventually will have to lay the main foundation of the psychological building. Any psychologist will subscribe to that. Reflexology is the general principle, the foundation. Until now, while the building of the foundation common to animals and men was in process, while we were talking of the simple elementary, there was no need to take the mind into account. But this is a temporary phenomenon. When the 20 years of experience will have become 30 years, the situation will change. That is what I said in the beginning, that the crisis of methods in reflexology begins precisely when they turn from the foundation, from the elementary and simple, to the substructure, to the complex and subtle. Academician Bekhterev expresses himself even more decidedly and openly, and therefore takes a view that is still more intrinsically inconsistent and contradictory. It would be a big mistake, he says, to regard subjective process as completely superfluous or subsidiary phenomena in nature, epiphenomena. For we know that everything superfluous in nature becomes atrophied and obliterated, whereas our own experiences tell us that its subject phenomena reach their highest development in the most complex process of correlative activity. Is it possible, one may ask, to exclude the study of those phenomena that reach their highest development in the most complex process of correlative activity, and that science that has precisely this correlative activity as its subject of study? But Academician Bekhterev does not exclude subjective psychology and draws a boundary line between it and reflexology. For it is clear to everyone that here only one of two things is possible. One, a complete explanation of the correlative activity without a mind. This is accepted by academician Bekhterev, and then the mind is made into a superfluous, unnecessary phenomenon, which Bekhterev denies. Two, or such an explanation is possible. Is it possible then to accept that accept a subjective psychology and market from a science of behavior, etc.? Accepting neither of the two alternatives, academician Bekhterev talks about the relation between the two sciences, about the possible rapprochement in the future. But as for this, the time has not yet come. We can for the time being defend the point of view of the close interaction of one and the other discipline. Further, academician Bekhterev speaks about the possible and even inevitable future construction of reflexology with particular consideration for subjective phenomena. But if the mind is inseparable from correlative activity and reaches its highest development precisely in its highest forms, how can we then study them separately? That is only one that is only possible when we assume that both sides of the matter are heterogeneous and essentially different, which for a long time has been defended by psychology. But academician Bekhterev dismisses the theory of psychological parallelism and interaction and claims precisely the unit of mental and nervous process. Academician Bekhterev often speaks about the relation between subjective, mind, and objective phenomena, but all the time clearly defends a dualistic point of view. And in essence, dualism is a real name of academician Pavlov and Bekhtérev's point of view. For Bekhterev, experimental psychology is unacceptable precisely because it studies the internal world of the mind with the method of self-observation. Academician Bekhterev wishes to consider its results irrespective of the process of consciousness. And about the methods, he openly says that reflexology uses its own strictly objective methods. With regard to methods, however, we have seen that reflexology itself acknowledges their complete coincidence with the psychological methods. Thus, two sciences with the same subject of investigation, the behavior of man, and that use the same methods, nevertheless, despite everything, remain different sciences. What prevents them from merging? Subject are mental phenomena. The reflexologist repeating in a thousand ways, but is the mind equivalent to subjective phenomena? In their views on this question, the decisive question, the reflexologists defend purely idealistic points of view and a dualism which might more correctly be called an idealism turned upside down. For academicians Pavlov and Bekhterev, they are non-spatial and non-causal phenomena. They have no objective existence whatsoever, as they can only be studied on oneself. But both Bekhterev and Pavlov know that they rule our life. Nevertheless, they consider this phenomena, the mind, to be something different from the reflexes, something which has to be studied separately and independently, of which we have to study the reflexes. This is, of course, materialism of the purest order, to ignore the mind. But it is materialism only in its own area. Outside of it is idealism of the purest order, to single out the mind and its study from the general system of human behavior. Mind without behavior is an impossible as behavior without mind, if only because they are the same. Subjective states, mental phenomena, exist, according to academician Bekhterev, in the case of an electric potential, in the case of reflexes, of concentration connected with the inhibition of a nervous current, In the case where new connections are set going, what kind of mysterious phenomena are they? Is it not clear now that they can be completely and fully reduced to reactions of the organism, to reactions that are reflected by other systems or reflexes, by speech, by feeling, mimic, somatic reflexes, etc.? Psychology has to state and solve the problem of consciousness by saying that is the interaction, the reflection, the mutual stipulation of various systems of reflexes. It is what is transmitted in the form of stimulus to other systems and elicits a response in them. Consciousness is a response apparatus. That is why subjective experiences are only accessible to me. Only I perceive my reflexes as stimuli. In this sense, James, who showed in a brilliant analysis that nothing forces us to accept the fact of the existence of consciousness as something distinguished from the world, is profoundly right, although he denied neither our experiences nor the awareness of them. Does consciousness exist? The whole difference between consciousnesses and the world, between the reflex to a reflex and reflex to stimuli, is only in the context of the phenomena. In the context of stimuli, it is the world. In the context of my reflexes, it is consciousness. This window is an object, the stimulus of my reflexes. The same window with the same qualities in my sensation, a reflex transmitted to other systems. Consciousness is only the reflex of consciousness. Consciousness is only the reflex of reflexes. I correct. To claim that consciousness too has to be understood as a reaction of the organism to its own reactions, one has to be a bigger reflexologist than Pavlov himself. So be it. If one wishes to be consistent, one sometimes has to raise objections to health, hardness, and be a bigger papist than the Pope, a bigger royalist than the king. Kings are not always royalists. When reflexology excludes mental phenomena from the circle of its investigations because they do not fall under its jurisdiction, it acts just like idealistic psychologists who study the mind as having nothing whatsoever to do with anything else, as an isolated world. By the way, psychology hardly ever excluded from its jurisdiction on principle the objective side of mental process and did not isolate the circle of internal life, viewed as a desert island of the spirit. Subjective states in themselves, out of space and casuality, does not exist. Therefore, a science studying them cannot exist either. But to study the behavior of men without mind, as reflexology wishes to do, is as impossible as to study mind without behavior. There is no place, consequently, for two different sciences, and it does not require great perspicacity to see what the mind is the same collective activity, that consciousness is collective activity within the organism itself, within the nervous system, collective activity of the human body with itself. The contemporary state of both branches of knowledge urgently raised the question of the necessity and fruitfulness of a complete merging of both sciences. Psychology experiences most serious crises both in the West and in the USSR. A heap of a raw material. It was called by James. The contemporary state of the psychologist is compared by a Russian author to that of a Priam of the Rings of Troy. Everything collapsed. That is the result of a crisis that was not confined to Russia. But reflexology, having built the foundation, reached a dead end too. The two sciences cannot manage without each other. It is imperative and vital to elaborate common scientifically objective methods, a common formulation of the most important problems that each science treats separately and that can no more be posed, let alone solved. And isn't it clear that the superstructure cannot be built except on the foundation? but that the builders of the foundation too, having finished, cannot lay another stone without checking it against the principles and the character of the building to be erected. We have to speak openly. The enigmas of consciousness, the enigmas of the mind cannot be avoided with any methodological tricks or subterfuges of principle. You cannot cheat them. James asked whether consciousness exists and answered that breathing exists. Of this he was convinced, but about consciousness he was in doubt. But that is an epistemological statement of the problem. Psychologically speaking, consciousness is an indisputable fact, a primary reality, a fact of the greatest significance, and not a secondary or accidental one. About this, there is no dispute. Thus, we should have and might have put aside the problem, but not have removed it, as long as in the new psychology one does not make both ends meet. The problem of consciousness will not be stated clearly and fearlessly, and it will not be solved in an experimentally objective way. On which level do conscious indications of reflexes evolve? What is their nervous mechanism, the details of their course, their biological sense? These questions we have to pose, and we have to prepare to work on them, to solve them in an empirical way. The only thing is to state the problem correctly and timely, and then the solution will sooner or later be found. Academician Bekhterev, in his energetic enthusiasm, talks to the point of panpsychism, is stating that plants and animals are animated beings. In another place, he cannot bring himself to repudiate the hypothesis about a soul, and in such primitive ignorance with respect to the mind reflexology will remain as long as it steers clear of the mind and isolates itself in the narrow circle of psychological materialism. To be a materialist in psychology is not difficult. Try to be it in psychology, and if you cannot, you will remain an idealist. Quite recently, the issue with self-observation and its role in psychological investigation sharped acutely under the influence of two facts. On the one hand, objective psychology, which apparently initially was inclined to sweep aside introspection completely and thoroughly, begins later to try to find the objective meaning of what is called introspection. Watson, Weiss, and others spoke about verbalized behavior, and they link introspection with the functioning of this verbal side of our behavior. Others talk about introspective behavior, about symptomatic speech, behavior, etc. On the other hand, the new current is German psychology, the so-called Gestalt psychology, which acquired tremendous influence in the last 3 to 4 years, raised sharp criticisms on both fronts, accusing both empirical psychology and behaviorism of the same sin, not to be able to study the real, daily behavior of men with a single accepted method, objective or subjective. Both of these facts add new complications to the questions of the value of the self-observation and therefore compel us to carry out a systematic examination of those essentially different forms of self-observation that are used by the three sides in the debate. The following lines present an attempt to systematize the question. But as a preliminary, we make some general remarks. It is first of all remarkable that in this new complication of the problem attempts to solve it take place during a more and more explicit crisis within empirical psychology itself. Nothing could be more false than the attempt to picture the crisis that breaks up Russian science into two camps as a local Russian crisis. The crisis in psychology now takes place on a worldwide scale. The rise of the psychological school of Gestalt theory which can come from the depths of empirical psychology, clearly testifies to this. Of what do these psychologists accuse introspection? Essentially, that is, in using this method of investigation, the mental phenomena inevitably become subjective because introspection, which requires analytical attention, always isolates contents from their own connections and inserts them into a new connection. The connection of the subject, the ego. Using this method, the experience inevitably becomes subjective. Kafka compares introspection, which can only study clear experience, with a pair of glasses and a magnifying glass, which we utilize when we cannot read a letter. But where is a magnifying glass? A magnifying glass does not alter the object but helps to observe it more clearly. Introspection changes the very object of observation. When we compare weights, Kafka says the real psychological description in this view should not be "this weight is heavier than that," but "my sensation of tension is now stronger than before." In this way, such a method of study transforms that which is objective in itself into something subjective. The new psychologists acknowledge the heroic bankruptcy bankruptcy of the Wurzburg School and the impotence of empirical, experimental psychology as a whole. It is true, the psychologists also acknowledge the futility of the purely objective method. These psychologists put forward a functional and integrative point of view. For them, the conscious processes are only part processes of larger wholes, and therefore we may subject our ideas to a functional verification by the objective facts by following the conscious part of a larger process whole beyond the conscious limits. A psychology which accepts that self-observation is not the main, most important method of psychology, it speaks only about real, about reliable self-observation, which is tested by the consequences that functionally follow from it and is confirmed by the facts. Thus we see that while on the one hand Russian reflexology and American behaviorism attempt to find objective self-observation, the best representatives of empirical psychology seek for real, reliable self-observation as well. In order to answer the question of what it involves, it is necessary to systematize all forms of self-observation and to consider each one separately. We can distinguish five main forms. The instruction to the subject. This is, of course, partially introspection, for it presupposes the internal conscious organization of the subject behavior. He who attempts to avoid it in experiments with men is in error, for he changes the manifest and accountable instruction for the self-instruction of the subject, an instruction which is suggested by the circumstances of the experiment, etc. Hardly anyone will dispute the necessity of instruction. The utterances of the subject concerning the external object. Two circles are shown. This one is blue, that one is white. Such a form of introspection, in particular when it's verified by the functional change of series of stimuli and a series of utterances, not one blue circle, but a series of blue circles that become gradually darker or lighter, can also be reliable. The utterances of the subject concerning his own internal reactions. I have pen. I like it. 3. The utterances of the subject concerning his own internal reactions. I have pain, I like it, etc. This is a less reliable form of introspection. However, it can be objectively verified and can be accepted. 4. The disclosure of a hidden reaction. The subject mentions a number he has thought of, tells how his tongue lies in his mouth, repeats a word he has thought of, etc. This is that form of indirect disclosure of a reaction which we defended in this article. 5. Finally, the detailed descriptions of his internal states by the subject, the Augsburg method. This is the type of introspection that is most unreliable and most difficult to verify. Here the subject is put in the position of an observer. His observer, observe as the English psychology says, the subject and not the object of the experiment. The experimenter only observes and records what happens. Here, instead of facts, we get ready-made theories. It seems to me that the question of the scientific reliability of the self-observation can only be solved in a way similar to the practical value of the testimonies given by the victim and the culprit in an inquest. Both are partial. We know that a priori, and therefore there include elements of deception, may they are completely false. Therefore, it would be madness to rely on them. But does this mean that in a lawsuit we do not have to listen to them at all and only have to interrogate the witnesses? This would be madness as well. We listen to the accused and the victim, verify, compare, turn to the material evidence, documents, traces, testimonies of the witnesses. Here, too, we may have false evidence, and that is how we establish a fact. We should not forget that there are whole sciences that cannot study their subject through direct observation. The historian and the geologist reconstructs the fact, which already do not exist, indirectly and nevertheless in the end, and they study the facts that have been, not the traces or the documents that remained and were preserved. Similarly, the psychologist is often in the position of the historian and the geologist. Then he acts like a detective who brings to light a crime he never witnessed. And that is the end of it. The notes were not written. The notes were not read. Okay, bye. Thank you for myself, for creating this audiobook for myself. Bye.